Why do birds from far off places sometimes accidentally land in our own backyards?
What triggers our pets to shed their fur at the same time as deer, rabbits, and other mammals? And why do snakes get in on this molting action as well?
Everyone loves the smell of the rain, but why is that? And what is the smell of the rain anyway?
All this and more on this week's episode of Nature Notes with Hike Hearth.
Have you ever been out birding and spotted something so unusual that you did a double take? Maybe it was a bird you've never seen before or one that didn't even belong in the area. Well, that's exactly what we're talking about in this week's question of the week. What are some of the most unusual birds that we've seen in our own region of New England? So, Dustin, let's start with the basics. What makes a bird what I would call unusual in the context of our New England region? Are we talking about birds that are just rare? Or is there more to it than that?
Birds can be rare, but they're never random. Remember that, we'll come back to it. Birds mainly end up in weird places for three reasons. They become unusual because they're far outside of their normal range, but rarely in a habitat that does not suit them. So these types of vagrants fall into three categories. First one is birds that wander off course during migration. We call them vagrants. Storm-driven birds are ones that are moved out by weather or hurricanes, for example. Some birds are known to sort of be disrupted by northeasters all the time. The third one is escaped exotics, birds that got discovered and were thought to be weird, but turns out they just wandered off of a farm or something like that. These sights are exciting because they're unpredictable, but remember, they might be rare, but they're not random.
Got it. Okay. So, with that said, we've got the setup. Now let's talk about the part that I think is really interesting. Can you give us some examples of unusual birds that you're aware of that have been spotted in New England over the years?
Absolutely. And this year actually was a pretty good year. So most of the ones we're going to talk about were nearby in Massachusetts or around this year.
No kidding.
Yes. So the first one is the pink-footed goose. This is a rare visitor from Greenland or Iceland. It sometimes gets mixed up with other flocks, especially when it arrives here. So you'll see them mixed in with, say, Canada geese. So keep your eyes open for them. They're smaller, a little different coloring, and they have distinctive pink feet. This is also the rare goose that one of the characters in the movie A Big Year was looking for at the end to get over the hump. I believe it was Jack Black.
Too bad he wasn't here in New England.
I've birded with that gentleman that played Jack Black in the movie, actually.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. Next up is a fork-tailed flycatcher, not to be confused with the scissor-tailed flycatcher, which lives in Texas and extreme southern Florida. But a fork-tailed flycatcher comes from the Caribbean and can wander all the way up to Canada, but often get blown in from southern South America and occasionally wanders north. They have a long forked tail and do some aerial acrobatics that make their flight such a striking sight to see. Most of those sightings occur in late summer or fall because they get off track, partly blown by storms and partly just their migration sense goes a little haywire. Next up is a rufous hummingbird. Here in the east, we basically have one breeding hummingbird, just the ruby-throated hummingbird. But in the fall, it's very common. Actually, there's often 5 or 10 or more discovered rufous hummingbirds in the Northeast because they somehow, instead of flying south like they're supposed to, they accidentally fly east first before they start flying south. So we end up seeing some rufous hummingbirds at feeders around New England almost every year.
And you brought this up in last week's episode 11 of the vodcast, when we were talking about how animals use Earth's magnetic field for their navigation. This was one of the animals that used as an example that can sometimes get a little disoriented.
That's right. And it makes it worthwhile to leave your hummingbird nectar feeder up longer than you think in the fall. Even when your ruby-throateds are gone by September 15th or certainly by October 1st, leave it up for a couple extra weeks. The nights are cold, your nectar doesn't spoil at those temperatures, and you might just get a vagrant right outside your window.
Okay. What else do you got for us?
Next up is a northern lapwing. This is a European bird that somehow wanders across the Atlantic Ocean occasionally when it's blown off course. They have a crested head. They almost look like a killdeer that we're pretty familiar with, but with the crest of, say, a cardinal on top. So it looks unlike any other shorebird that we have in the Northeast. So these are historically rare, but sightings have increased in recent years, maybe due to rising ocean temperatures. And then lastly, in late 2021 into early 2022, you'll recall we went and chased a Steller's sea eagle. This was by far the rarest, most publicized vagrant maybe that ever visited New England. So the Steller's sea eagle is a bird that wandered. It's not unusual for it to wander from Russia and northern, sort of north of Japan, over into the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. They routinely interact with bald eagles up there. But in the winter of 2020, you remember the Texas grid went down because they had massive ice storms down in Texas. For some reason, whether it was that storm or just this bird blown crazy off course, it went from northern Alaska down to Texas, and it was spotted there, and birders lost their minds over it. And then later in the year, it showed up in the days before Christmas in Massachusetts, and then by New Year's, it was up in southern Maine and has since moved into Newfoundland, but it's been living successfully among the bald eagles in Newfoundland ever since.
I'm glad to hear that. I was curious about what happened to that bird. I will say that situation, when we went to go look for this bird, you would have thought Taylor Swift had landed in Booth Bay Harbor, because there were just people running amok with cameras everywhere. Cars, like it was like the biggest fangirl scene I have ever seen, outside of like accidentally ending up in an urban area when a celebrity's coming through, because I'm not a crowd person, so I'm not fangirling, but boy, man, that was wild.
Yeah, there was some Booth Bay paparazzi for sure.
Okay, so you mentioned that all of these unusual birds fall into a few categories at the start of this segment. Can you kind of like, how did they get here? Can you go into a little bit more details for us on that?
Sure. It could be any one of these factors or a combination of them interplaying with one another. But weather patterns play a strong factor. Sometimes if there's a hurricane, the heavy winds, everyone knows about the eye of the hurricane where it's calm in the middle. Well, sometimes birds that ended up in the calm middle because they didn't want to fly into the storm get trapped in that eye and they move with the hurricane.
Oh, no.
And then when the hurricane breaks up, say when it gets maybe north of the Carolinas, right? So you might get a bird from Cuba that got pulled up north of the Carolinas. When the hurricane finally breaks up, that bird suddenly is like not in Kansas anymore, not in Cuba anymore.
That poor bird.
Right. Other storms like nor'easters and hurricanes will also push birds, say, northward or eastward. This happens a lot with the northern lapwings. If they get caught up in a nor'easter over the Atlantic, it kind of pushes them up. And so they'll stay ahead of the leading edge and get pushed where the storm is pushing them, not so much trapped in the inside like the first example. But then they also have navigation errors. Young birds, they don't have experience migrating. They might take a wrong turn. Their internal magnetometer might be a little bit misaligned, so it's pointing them in the wrong direction. Or if they encountered a magnetic field disruption like we talked about last week in episode 11. And it requires a little bit of experience. And if they don't have the experience, when they get off course, they just don't know it, and they end up where they end up. Next is climate change. We've got some shifting temperatures, shifting weather patterns, and shifting ocean temperatures that are moving the food sources around. So if they're moving after a food source and those food sources aren't in the same place, they might be used to, flying west until they get to the large school of herring or something. But if that school's not there, they just keep flying west until they find themselves in the wrong spot. And then the last one is eruptions. We've talked about these a little bit before, where birds just end up moving south in large numbers. These are rather regular. If not every year, there's sort of routine that they do move when they're in need of either to spread out because there's been a large population explosion where they're from and they need to spread out in order to make the local food source last for them, or there's a particularly bad food year, like if the voles are low or something in their home, then they move down, or seed crops, particularly in the boreal forest. So oftentimes, especially in winter, we get lots of vagrants with things like pine grosbeaks, evening grosbeaks, pine siskins, red crossbills, white-winged crossbills, those sorts of things, because they're spreading out looking for food. The same thing happened sort of this year where we had hardly any cedar waxwings and Bohemian waxwings around New England because we had a super dry summer. The berries on the multiflora rose and the other native plants were sort of like all dried up and not very good. The cedar waxwings took off. So someone else is experiencing more cedar waxwings than they're used to, and we don't really have any this winter.
This reminds me, and you're going to be very proud of me as the bird adjacent one in the relationship, but you brought up in a previous episode, I can't remember which one, but an eruption taking place in I think you said Michigan with the great gray owls. and there being more of those that ended up down in Michigan because of food scarcity.
Yeah, this year was a big eruption year for them. Probably, I think I was talking about Minnesota, but it probably happened in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan as well, where those birds are typically up in Canada, but they're coming down mainly to either separate themselves from other owls in such food competition for mice and voles, or that the food situation up north wasn't great for whatever reason, so they came down.
Okay. All right. So I'm glad that we opened up the conversation through some of this discussion, especially about eruptions, to include more than just the US. So we're talking about New England, but we're really doing it as an example for any of you listening in other parts of the country to understand that, like, there's always going to be an opportunity to potentially see an unusual bird in your area. And so that's my little segue into talking to you about, if our viewers watching want to spot an unusual bird in the course of their birding or bird watching, how do you go about that? Like, how did you know that Steller's sea eagle was a big deal, unusual opportunity in our area? How do you find that information as a birder? And I'm also going to add in, are there certain areas where that's more likely to happen? From kind of an ecosystem standpoint, are there certain times of year where that's more likely to happen? What should people look for?
This comes to so a couple years ago, I went to a lecture by the famous ornithologist, David Allen Sibley. Sibley's birds is in our background right there. And he said as part of his lecture, when you see a rare bird, know that it's rare, but it's not random. Even when a bird ends up outside of its usual range, it really needs the habitat that it's adapted to. You can't get a desert bird living for very long on the seacoast. You can't get a marshland wetlands bird living for very long successfully in, an arid climate, right? The other way around. So it's important to know that when stuff happens and birds get out of place, yes, it's rare that they ended up here, but it's not random where they end up.
Got it.
And some of those birds that wander also wander repeatedly to the same places. So there's been a few birds that have been known to come up to Cape Cod, and even though they are rare and it's the only one of that species, that it's escaping me for the moment, it'll come to me, I hope. Maybe we can pop it in later. But it's come back every single year for like 15 years now. So there's new birders that have heard about this and want to go see that bird, and it shows up every year because it's just whatever its migrating malfunction is, it's happening routine. So rare, but not random, even in that example. So it's important to know where those hotspots are. So in the coastal areas, for example, in New England, there's Cape Cod at points like Race Point Beach, which is the northernmost tip of Cape Cod, Monomoy Island, and the Plum Island National Wildlife Refuge. And then there's some migration traps like headlands, peninsulas, and islands where birds get concentrated during migration. For example, Satchwest Point National Wildlife Refuge in Rhode Island is a great example of this. And there's a place in Pennsylvania called the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, where the topography of the land is sort of two mountain ranges that from north to south come together in a narrowing V. And so the migrating birds coming southward get funneled into that V, and they all fly low overhead if you're up at that sanctuary watching or doing a hawk count like we did last fall. Mm-hmm. And that means if there's a rare bird that's coming down, it's going to get funneled with all the other birds through that area. So you might have a good chance of finding them at a place like that. But then how to know about them? Well, use eBird to identify any rarities. Pay attention to the listservs or the Facebook groups or the different social media channels that have local birders talking about what's around, because sure enough, you'll hear, people like to, I don't want to say brag, but they like to broadcast what rarity they found. And if they saw it, you'll probably hear about it too. But get active in your birding community as well, right? There's local birding groups all over the place. Birding groups like the Brookline Bird Club in the Boston area, in our area. There's a group called the Boxborough Birders a few towns from us. Groups like that also have local email chains if something might not be super rare, but it's rare for your area. Those are great birds to get, especially for newer birders, who I think are some of our most popular listeners right now. And then lastly, for timing, right? Be a little bit more aware of it at the times of year when it's going to happen the most, particularly August to November. That migration pattern in the fall, that's when those first time migrants are migrating. And that's a good time to find some rarities for sure. And of course, after any major snowstorms, storms in general, not just snowstorms. And don't be afraid to go birding when weather seems suboptimal for people. Just because it seems rainy and foggy doesn't mean the birds don't get a choice to not live in the habitat just because it happens to be rainy. They might be hunkered down, but oftentimes those are great conditions to see birds, including migrants, are here, unusually.
As you know, I love my trivia, especially about nature. It's honestly one of the ways that I get excited about nature. Any fun facts that you uncovered about unusual bird sightings when I told you that I wanted you to research this topic for this week's episode?
Yeah, the ones that stood out to me were in talking about the pink-footed goose. I learned they can fly over 1,500 miles nonstop in one go, and that's a huge distance for a large, heavy-bodied bird like a goose. We've talked about some really long migrants before, but that's a big feat for a relatively large bird. And then others like the fork-tailed flycatcher I mentioned, they're known for sort of incredible wandering abilities. They typically come from southern South America and might be spotted as far as northern Canada. So they're a good one to sort of keep in the back of your mind to try to get on your life list someday, because it could happen. Now, listeners, I want to hear from you. Have you ever spotted an unusual bird in New England or elsewhere? What was it? Where did you see it? So drop us a comment and let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you have a question that you'd like us to answer in our Question of the Week series, which is typically about birding, leave it in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on your notifications so that you never miss a Hike and Hearth episode where we might cover one of your questions.
Have you ever wondered why your dog leaves tufts of fur all over the house in the spring? Or why deer look so patchy at this time of year? Today, we're diving into the science of shedding, why animals lose their winter coats, how it works, and some of the weirdest shedding adaptations in nature.
All right, so I think we need to start with the basics. Starting at the beginning is always a very good place to start. As Julie Andrews once reminded us in an amazing movie that Dustin doesn't like to watch with me, what triggers shedding in animals? Is it the warmer weather? Is there more to it? That's the first question we're going to tackle.
Okay, so the primary trigger for shedding is called the photoperiod. That's the length or the amount of daylight. So as our day starts to get longer in terms of daylight, the animals sense that sort of intrinsically, and that triggers the hormones that get their shedding processes to start. So as days get longer in the spring, their brains detect that and they begin to regulate their hair growth and loss. Some animals shed in patches like deer, while others undergo a full molt. For example, snowshoe hares. Fur shedding basically happens in three main phases called anagen, telogen, and exogen. Anagen is when hair actively grows out of the follicle. The telogen is the resting phase where hair growth stops and the follicle becomes dormant for a time. And then lastly is the shedding phase, or the exogen, where old hair is shed to make way for new growth.
Yeah, and so what I think is interesting as an area of this topic to explore is why some animals shed in patches, but yet we know there's other animals that shed completely, like they molt very quickly in comparison, right?
Well, it depends on the animal's ecological needs. Deer shed in patches because it helps them maintain some insulation while they're adapting to warmer weather. Basically, they hold on to whole patches of fur, winter fur, until the new fur is under it and it kind of pushes it out all at once. Hares molt completely because they need to change their camouflage from white snow camouflage in the winter to their light brown, bare ground camouflage for spring.
Right. And so that's mammals. So now we've covered the hair growth cycle and why some of them molt all at once versus others will do it in patches. But other animals shed too. And they also have variations in how they shed or molt, correct?
Right. Molting is a nearly universal process among birds because feathers wear out. They need to be replaced for better flight, insulation, and display purposes to attract their lady friends, mostly. But the frequency and extent of molting can vary significantly between species. Some of them go through a catastrophic molt. This is when a bird replaces all of its feathers at once rather than gradually. This can take anywhere from a few weeks to a couple of months. A great example of this is Canada geese, one of your favorite birds, and one easy to see. When they have their babies in the spring, they don't really have a need to fly. They need to protect their babies. So they replace all of their feathers at once, and they actually go through weeks where they can't fly.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yep. This can be really highly efficient for birds that need their feathers in top conditions for specific purposes, like waterproofing or long distance flight, but it can leave them vulnerable during the molting season. It impacts their ability to fly or perform other crucial activities, and it can interrupt their ability to control their body temperature as well. So most of them do it kind of late in the summer when the weather is pretty mild. The second type is called a biennial molt. This occurs once every 2 years. Species with this pattern tend to have feathers that are really durable and resistant to wear and tear. They're energy efficient, and it allows birds to spend more time on other activities like breeding or long distance migration. Birds that go through this biennial molt process tend to be large seabirds like albatrosses. Next are birds that rarely molt. These are birds that have feathers that are highly specialized because they live in stable environments where feather wear is minimal. They're adapted to their particular ecological needs, such as living in water or having feathers that don't experience much wear. So examples for this are ostriches, emus, seabirds with specialized feathers like puffins and birds of paradise. And then finally, some birds don't molt at all. They simply molt so infrequently that it's practically negligible. They selectively are bred to reduce molting and have evolved in the environment where feather wear is minimal. Examples include domesticated birds like chicken breeds and some tropical birds too.
Let's move on to reptiles at this point. So mammals shed because of the seasons. Birds molt because of their activities, so to speak. Reptiles don't seem like they would shed or molt for either of those reasons.
Right, but reptiles molt for another reason. Primarily, snakes and lizards molt as a response to growth, not the season. So younger reptiles literally shed their skin because their body has outgrown it. They grow fresh, new skin to their new size, and their old skin kind of splits off, and often they can slither out of it, almost leaving it in one piece behind.
I feel like we've fully covered exactly what's going on from a birds and mammals and reptiles standpoint. But what we haven't talked about is marine mammals. How do they handle the whole process of shedding?
Well, they sort of continually slough off their old skin cells to maintain a smooth hydrodynamic surface. Think dolphins and porpoises, things like that. This helps them reduce drag and allows them to swim efficiently. Some marine mammals, like dolphins, have specialized skin that produces a mucus-like coating. This reduces the friction and protects them against parasites. It's sort of like a scum layer on the outside of their skin.
Yum.
Which the same is true for your like aquarium pet fish. Mm-hmm. That's why you shouldn't pat your axolotl, for example.
Yes.
Not that he's a marine mammal. He's not. But seals and sea lions undergo seasonal changes in their undercoat as well. These are for species with fur, or there's changes in their blubber thickness as well. So this helps them to adapt to temperature changes. Unique challenges like barnacle growth on their skin, for example, can also be impacted. So they need to slough off their skin, so it helps them shed barnacles and make sure they don't get overtaken by that parasite, basically. Humpback whales are like this. They've developed rough patches of skin where barnacles can attach without causing harm. So they've kind of accepted that they need to adapt to be able to handle those sorts of parasites. And then marine mammals that don't need fur or feathers, this is because their environment, the water, provides a consistent temperature regulation and less wear and tear on their skin. If you live in the ocean, particularly if you're not a long-distance migrant, the temperature of your environment doesn't shift very much.
What do you think some of the strangest shedding adaptations are in nature?
Oh, that's a good question. I think caribou and reindeer are pretty interesting. They shed their whole antler every year, not just their fur. So we've got a great moose antler on our mantle over there that I love looking at year round. But when I know it's that time of year for them to lose their antlers, someday I'll find a deer antler out in the woods, but I've yet to come across my own shed antler. So those are pretty cool. Males shed them after the mating season, and females shed them after giving birth, typically. Horses grow and shed extra facial whiskers depending on the season. So
that's cute.
Yeah. Hey, I don't know why they need that. And then domestic animals like dogs, some of them don't shed naturally, essentially because we've selectively bred them for our own convenience.
Well, you know what? I'm glad you said you're not entirely sure why the whiskers thing happens, because it's hormones. So here we go with Geek Alert.
Well, hormones trigger, but why do they need extra whiskers?
I don't know. I don't know. Here's what I do know, though. All right. So antler shedding in males is testosterone and progesterone levels in females. So that is what's triggering those things to happen. And whisker growth is a seasonal change affected by the melatonin production in a horse.
Right, but I understand the biological reason for the antlers to be shed because the males use antlers to battle one another and assert their dominance. And once the mating season's over, they no longer have that need, so they can shed the extra weight, the sort of entanglement danger that the antlers provide. But I don't understand how horses use their extra whiskers.
I know. I'm now remembering when I was reading up on the melatonin being the cause of this. Now I remember. So
they are grazing animals, I'll give you that. And in the wintertime, there's
it's
less
dark.
grass.
It's dark. At different times, at different seasons, there's varying levels of darkness. And being grazing animals, they need more whiskers at certain times of year to help them sense their surroundings when they're trying to eat.
There we have it, folks. I always thought I had the sense to grow my whiskers more in the winter just because I was like a hardy New England man and then it was the right thing to do for the cold, but it's so that I can graze better.
Right. So if I ask you to sum up for our audience why these variations have evolved, what is the answer?
It's all about survival and adaptation.
Exactly.
So shedding helps conserve energy, whiskers improve sensory perception, and non-shedding coats and dogs were bred for human convenience. This is all a reminder of how adaptable nature is. Whether it's a deer losing its winter coat or snake shedding its skin, these processes are all about growth, survival, and renewal. And I'd like to know from our audience, have you ever come across some evidence of molting or shedding out in the wild? Drop us a comment, let us know about it.
Yeah, and if you're leaving snake skins on your partner's kitchen table, I'd like to know that as well.
Yep, no container needed.
Is it just me or is it everybody? Also, if you've enjoyed our deep dive today into the science of shedding, don't forget to subscribe, turn on those notifications so you never miss one of these segments.
Who doesn't love a good snake skin?
There's a smell in the air, a smell so familiar and so comforting that it seems to whisper secrets of the soil. It's the scent of spring rain. Can you smell that? That earthy aroma that makes you want to take a deep breath and smile. But what if I told you it's not just dirt? What if it's something far more peculiar that you're smelling? Today, we're diving into the science of geosmin, the chemical behind that unmistakable smell. And trust me, this story is dirtier than you think.
So what exactly is geosmin? It's a chemical compound produced by soil bacteria called actinomycetes. These tiny microbes are like the perfume makers of the dirt world, and they release geosmin when they break down organic matter. But here's the kicker. Human noses are crazy sensitive to it. We can detect geosmin at concentrations as low as 5 parts per trillion. To put that in perspective, it's like smelling a single drop of water in 200 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Even sharks are not that sensitive to blood.
But why do we love this smell so much? Well, it might be written in our DNA. Evolutionary theory suggests that our ancestors relied on rain for survival, so we developed a positive association with the scent of geosmin. It's like nature's way of saying water is nearby. And believe it or not, companies have tried to bottle this smell for perfumes, but it never works out because it turns out geosmin is a bit of a diva and it doesn't play well with other scents.
And here's where it gets even weirder. Some animals have taken geosmin to the next level. Camels, like you might expect, can smell it in the air from miles away and use it to find water in the desert. For them, it's like a built-in GPS for hydration. But not all animals are fans of it. Some fish use geosmin as a warning sign that a body of water is stagnant and potentially dangerous. And if you've ever tasted dirt in your salad, you can blame geosmin for that too. It's what gives beets their earthy flavor.
So geosmin is the chemical behind that earthy spring smell. It's made by bacteria. We're crazy sensitive to it, and some animals use it to find food and water.
Next time it rains, take a deep breath and thank the bacteria for that fresh spring smell. They are the real MVPs of the soil.
That's all for today's episode. But before we head off on our next adventure, this is just a quick reminder that you can find Dustin's wildlife photography and links to all of our content channels on our website, hikeandhearth.com.
And we love being part of the YouTube nature lovers community, so keep sharing your comments on your experiences with nature, wildlife, and conservation. And if you're not already subscribed, be sure to join us.
Yes, and if you're on Substack, we just started our newsletter, Nature Notes with Hike and Hearth, so we can expand on some of the topics that we cover here on the vodcast. We have a whole bunch of other plans in mind for the Substack. We're having a great time on Notes, engaging with the nature community over there. It's a lot of fun. Subscribers are ramping up, so if you are on Substack, look us up and be sure to join us over there for deep dive summaries of our content. Okay, Dustin, are you ready to send us off for today?
I sure am. Until next time, friends, keep your eyes on the skies and your hearts in the wild.
Bye, everyone.